certainly you could read the poem.
You do, John.
I guess we should consider starting pretty quickly. I am first going to, in chat, I'm going to paste in the list of people who have agreed to speak and the order that we've set up. And of course, Bob doesn't appear to be here right now, so we'll skip him. If he shows up, we'll give him a chance to talk. I was going to kick this off, and I just want to say this is really, I wanted to make this pretty informal. When we decided to do this, I know that there was one other memorial service that was a kind of a live thing here in Austin. I wasn't able to go there. I was out of town at the time, but I thought that it would be good to create a conversation online about Ed via Zoom so that people from all over could transcend their geographical constraints and show up. So that's really the reason we put this together. But I've also, as the one who felt to organize it, I've made it as simple as I could because I think the real emphasis here is just on remembering Ed, and we didn't need any bells and whistles to do that. And I couldn't find a church organist, so here we are. Actually, what we should do is play some rock and roll in honor of Ed and his long history as one of the great rock historians.
Auto Salvage.
Hello? What was that?
Play Auto Salvage.
Oh, Auto Salvage. Yes, absolutely. Well, I'll have something to say about that. Ed was my friend for years. Our paths had crossed several times here in Austin, but we got closer in the 90s through our mutual friend connection with Eric Dice, who is here also. Eric had an email list that he invited me to join, and he also invited Ed to join it, and we became closer friends through that. We almost started a business together. We were at one time going to create a website that was dedicated to music of the South and Southwest. We were going to call it Swamp Dog. And I think it was a great idea. Ed was going to do the writing, and we were going to include access to music, and we were also going to sell like very Southwest style foods, Louisiana style foods, Cajun food, that sort of thing, seasonings and that sort of thing. And I think if we could have got that off the ground, it might have been a success. I thought it was.
It sounds great.
Huh?
Sounds great.
Yeah,
Why couldn't it happen?
We needed more leadership. We were not completely organized. We were trying to find someone to agree to be the CEO and to kind of help us, follow through. And we actually had somebody in mind for that and invited them to a meeting. And she showed up and told us that she thought it was a really great idea, but that she really couldn't be the one to make it happen. And we had too much else going on in our lives to devote ourselves to it. So we were trying to find somebody who would carry the torch. So that's really the reason it didn't happen. We had the URL. I mean, we had the domain name. If you could just build a business on a domain name, we could have done it.
Sounds like something you would take to a program like Shark Tank. You know Shark Tank.
Well, I'm not familiar with them, but certainly we could have done with some incubation.
Yeah.
We were not business guys. I actually learned more about business later after that. I actually became a businessman later, but at the time I wasn't really quite sure how to pull a business together. So just to continue my story, sometime after that, Ed, of course, was living in, I think he was living in Germany when I first started hanging out with him, and of course later moved to France. and was coming at least once a year to Austin for South by Southwest. And when he came to Austin, we decided we wanted to get together somehow. So we started having breakfast together at Kura's. And after a couple of years of doing that, we decided we would invite somebody else to join us. And we went a couple of years asking like one or another person to join. One year early on, we had Howard Rheingold was in town, so he joined us. And Nate Wilcox, who was on the call, also joined us. And that sort of evolved. We started inviting more and more people. And the way it kind of shook out was that I had connections who were more tech focused, and he had connections that were more music focused. And we found ourselves having an annual breakfast that just grew and grew. And it was a bunch of people coming together from both of those worlds, which were, of course, both represented at South by Southwest. And we kind of had a blast doing that. It was really fun doing that every year. The last year we could have done it, the last year that South by Southwest was live, we didn't quite get it together, but we did it for 2 decades. So that was pretty good. And one story I can tell about Ed, I was trying to think about what could I say about Ed that really sort of gets to the kind of person he was. You know, he was actually very generous and very helpful in many ways. I know, you know, we'll probably all say a few things about how he could be cranky and how he could be difficult at times, but Ed did some pretty wonderful things for me in particular. One thing that he did was he was aware that my sort of all-time favorite psychedelic band, I'm a big fan of psychedelic bands, and I had talked to him several times about Auto Salvage, a band that he was also very familiar with, and which I considered like the really great. That's the greatest album ever. They had one album and it was really great. And when Ed got wind from those guys, actually, I think he convinced them to come to South by Southwest and do a reunion. And once he set that up, he very quickly contacted me and he said, these guys that you like so much are going to be here, and I will make sure you meet them and we'll go to their shows. And we had a kind of a blast with those guys. And, you know, I never dreamed that I would ever see them play, but I saw them play. And Ed was thoughtful enough to remember that I liked the band and to make sure that I, you know, was in the audience for all of their gigs here. I think they played 3 different gigs, and that I got to hang out with them and meet them and so forth. So that was a real, to me, a sense of who Ed was. He was always looking out for his friends. He always, he would remember, you know, and he would try to make connections for you if he thought that they were interesting to you. And the one other thing I'll say about Ed is that for years, I thought about inviting him to dinner and couldn't do it because I had a real fear of what the result would be. I was afraid we would be critiqued. So we never had Ed over for dinner, and I feel bad about that. And, you know, I feel like, you know, that's something we really should have done. So really, that's it for me, and really welcome everybody. So glad that you could join us today. I want you to know that this is streaming live on YouTube at our Plutopia News Network channel, and people who couldn't make it to the live event can possibly watch this after the fact there. We're also recording it. And you probably got, I think Zoom alerts you when you join and there's recording going on, and I hope everybody's okay with the recording and the streaming. And I think that we can just now kind of take some time to hang out and talk. We have several people who have agreed to speak. And the first person who has agreed to speak after Bob Simmons, did Bob Simmons ever show up? Anybody see him in here? So I don't think he made it. So when Joe Nick talks, he can also read Bob's poem. But the first person to speak then after that would be, we know her as Frank Grauman, but Louise Ward. Louise is Ed's sister, and we're so happy to have you here, Louise.
I think I'm unmuted now.
Yeah, you're unmuted. Great.
Well, thank you for having me. So yes, I'm Louise. I'm Ed's only sibling. And I'm very pleased for the opportunity to say a few words today. I want to give a special shout out to Joe Nick Potosky, Jennifer Milbauer, Jennifer Kramer, Andrew Halbreich, and Kelly McEntee for their incredibly helpful and support of me personally as we've tried to work out sorting through Ed's stuff. So that is still in progress, but winding down. So I think it's appropriate for me to start out here because while I'm pretty sure I knew Ed longer than any of y'all, I also know probably the least about his adult life. So
Wow.
I'm going to be listening and taking note of all your stories. And I guess the only other thing I want to say is I'm going to put in a plug for my memorial page that I've I've made for him. That was my idea because I had no idea who to invite or where to have it, or clueless is the best way to describe it. So I thought if I made a web page and people could contribute it would be almost like having a memorial service, except it would, go on and on and on and on. So, there we go. That's it. So I don't know that it's showing up on searches now, but it is www.edwardmemorial.net. And my anecdotes about my anecdotes about our childhood are on there, and other things that people have sent me. And I invite, it's not by invitation only, but I invite anyone and everyone here, if they are so moved, to either fill out the form on the website or just write to me at lward@edwardmemorial.net, and I will post your story there for everyone to read. So that's my little plug. Thank you very much for letting me join, John. And, I'm ready to listen to your stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. So the next person to speak will be David Gans.
Unmuting myself. All right then.
Hey,
I
David.
have a cat who's kibitzing here. His name is Ringo. And he's curious about my screen. Ringo, I got to work now, okay, bud? I didn't know Ed all that well. We were friends and colleagues on the well for more than 20 years, and we interacted very, very deeply and extensively there, and only ever met in person a couple of times because we lived in very, in different places. He came to the Bay Area once or twice, and I remember having dinner with him in Bruce Cobal's shop one day. And the last time I was in Austin was, I think it was December of 2017, to do a performance with the Barton Hills Choir, and Ed made sure that I made time to get together with him for a meal, and that was the time I had my first and only experience with the michelada, which he explained to me at the restaurant. I was a part of a large group of people in the well who loved Ed and watched with horror as he did so many self-destructive things. I helped him get his book deal for the history of rock and roll because I was just publishing a book with Flatiron in 2015. So I had Bob Miller's ear, and I introduced him to Ed and helped facilitate his making the pitch that got him the deal. And then, of course, I watched with some horror as Ed complained about it and refused to do things that would help himself. And it was one of those things. It was like, dude, you got to get out of your own way here. And on the other hand, he just, as many people have already said, as you will hear going forward here, he was just incredibly generous and always wanted to help people. And he wanted to help me get a gig at South by Southwest, which is like the most insane thing. I'm this tiny, puny little independent hippie artist from California. and never even thought to try and get myself into South by Southwest because I don't have any infrastructure or nothing. But Ed somehow thought he could find a place for me in there, and he tried for several years without success. So I always appreciated his willingness to do whatever he could for people, and I always appreciated his sharing of his wisdom and his good taste in things. And I always kind of regretted his inability to take better care of himself. End of story.
Okay, thank you, David. And I will mention, I put the link to the well in chat. Ed was very active on the well, which is an online community. And I suspect many of you might be interested in the well if you want to check it out, if you decide to join. I know Ed got a lot from it. So next is Joe Nick Petoskey.
All right. Well, I'm going to interject with the person other than Louise, I think, who knew Ed the longest was Bob Simmons, Bob Simmons. And unfortunately, Bob Simmons is somewhere en route between Austin and San Francisco. So I'm going to read this, that he wrote this up. And he said that it was Silly Doggerel that he wrote as his eulogy for Edmund. Maybe someone will read it. I know he would have hated it, which is a good reason to send it along. Sometimes he liked working up a good distaste for things. As Randy Newman once sang, it gives me reason to live. This is Ode to Ed. He worked for Crawdaddy, he worked for Cream. He wrote Rock Crit that made them scream. He worked with Jan Wenner and with Terry Gross. He worked the East End and then the West Coast. He ended up in Austin, mostly by chance, where he covered music, though he never danced. He liked jazz and classical, R&B and country too. You must admit, he knew music like only a few. He scribbled and scribed about Austin's dives and tried to grok its mysterious vibes. Willie and Doug and Ken Threadgill were not enough to give Ed a big thrill. He thought Austin was a little town with a great big tude. His assessment was taken as being too rude, too crude. It started a feud. What is it with this dude? Let's dump Ed Ward. He's not on the team. He thinks he's Lester Fangs on amphetamines. He snipes, he carps, he says things unfair. He thinks we should try better to compare with rockers over here and over there, or with whoever just left town. Lucky for him, he liked a good fight. It got him through many a long night. Finally, he said, screw it, I'm going to Berlin. And there he stayed for years, about 10. Then off to France, Provence, mon Dieu. Then back to Texas, and another what? A new chance. I always knew Ed would no sooner in a place alight that he was soon looking to escape, to take flight. But wherever he is now, I wish him well, be it heaven or be it hell. I know he's telling the angels or devils how to make dinner and do it well. That's Bob Simmons on our friend Ed, and an honest assessment. And if Bob shows up, let him come and testify, because even when Ed was doing a talk at Book People on his second volume of the history of rock and roll, whenever anything questionable would come up, he would defer to the man in the audience, Bob Simmons, who knew everything about the 60s. And Ed wisely trusted his recall. Ed was the first rock critic I ever met at a time when I fancied being a rock critic as a living. And it started with so many of Ed's acquaintances with correspondence, which included really valuable information. Since he's died, I've heard from a lot of people who talked about, how he mentored me, even though despite all the troubles and travails that came with it. And I started thinking, he mentored me in a way early on, when in the early 1970s, when we started exchanging correspondence. It became very clear he was very interested in Texas, which was important to me because that's where I was based, and Texas was still the boonies, and here was a national writer interested in Texas. And I was interested in this idea of being a music writer, a rock critic, whatever you want to call it. And Ed imparted what might have been the most valuable information that I could have received at this time, which was the names of publicists at cool record labels, so I could get on publicity mailing lists and get all new product. And it wasn't just being able to have access to the newest and best stuff out there so I could pass judgment, which is what rock critics were supposed to do. But this was a means of making a living when you were trying to get by on a rock critic's income, which was next to nothing. You could take those promos, and if you could make friends with someone at a record store, you could get $1.50 a piece for the brand new Little Feat or that album from England by the band the Sex Pistols or whatever. You could always get a little bit of money and get by, and that was practical knowledge. So Ed and I corresponded. I'm not sure when we exactly met, because he was coming into Austin to see Commander Cody, to see his friends asleep at the wheel, who basically gave Ray Benson his start in many ways by giving him advice about music and teaching a rock history course at Antioch College. So Ed dug Texas. I dug this idea of becoming a rock critic. I know we met by the 1975 Willie Nelson picnic, in which Ed had his cowboy hat and his distinctive outfit, which kind of hinted of Texas, but it really wasn't Texas. This was all affectations. But Ed had already been there. He wrote the Texas chapter in the Rolling Stone Illustrated History of Rock and Roll. The best I could wangle from Jim Miller was Southern rock, but Ed was knowledgeable on this subject, and he had a lot of seniority, and it was just he saw Texas. He was there when Willie Nelson recorded Shotgun Willie in New York, as the seminal recording that changed Willie Nelson's life and career and whole art. And Ed was there. He was a witness. He saw all this stuff. So getting to hang with him at Willie's picnic was informative, although he gave me a tip hanging out in his hotel room by sitting there casually picking up the phone and calling a room service for a fifth of Jack Daniels, which magically was delivered 10 minutes later, and he signed for it. And I'm going, how did you do that? And he said, Neil Rush and Willie's manager. He flew us all down. He was taking care of us. I tried that 2 months later on Black Oak, Arkansas, at Arrowhead Stadium in Kansas City. And a minute after making the call to room service, I got a knock on the door. And it wasn't room service. It was the manager of Black Oak, Arkansas. And he was pissed. So his advice wasn't always the best. But 1977, 1978, we got to watch the Mothership Connection drop. Parliament Funkadelic did their first Mothership Connection drop in New Orleans. And Ed and I got to interview George Clinton and Bootsy Collins in a horse-drawn carriage going down Bourbon Street, which was the weirdest interview I've ever done in my life. And Ted was, I don't think it was any big deal. I worked my way, I weaseled my way into rock criticism to the point that in the late 70s, I was writing for Texas Monthly as a freelance. And I was also doing some part-time work, which became full-time at the Austin American Statesman until 1979, when I became such a smart ass. I knew enough about this business that I quit writing about bands, and I was going to manage this band that my girlfriend was playing in, Joe King Carrasco. So I told the editors at the American Statesman, where I'd basically had become a de facto rock critic. They were starting to give more attention to music. And on my way out, I recommended someone to the paper after talking to him. And yeah, there wasn't much going on with Ed at the time. And he was game enough to apply for this job at the American Statesman, for which he was hired. And I never had trouble with Ed as far as personally managing Joe King Carrasco or managing a band later, the True Believers. Ed was always kind to them. But boy, howdy, I was right in the middle of it. It's like when I saw, the Dump Ed Ward movement, and in particular, criticizing bands like the Lotions and Doug Somm. And you know what I consider today, and say, Ed was very critical of these bands and saying, the Lotions were they were a local reggae band. Ed had already not only passed judgment and reviewed, but sat in a hotel room and done weed with Bob Marley. He knew Bob Marley. He'd seen him play. And for him to pass judgment on the Lotions, Ed Ward was right. You know, how could he say that this man was worth a damn? I mean, Ed was not into being kind. He was into being a critic. And as far as being a critic goes, I've never known anyone who passed judgment to be as pure a critic as Ed. His problem was, if you want to call it a problem, is he didn't know when to shut it off. He was always passing judgment. And to me, I smile when I can hear Ed saying, "You're wrong." And because nothing gave me so much pleasure as to be able to point out in instances, "No, Ed, you're wrong." And I will say, famously, you know, he called it right on Doug Somm, who was being lazy, and on the Lotions, who were a hack local reggae band. But, you know, he blew it on Stevie Ray Vaughan. And I think, you know, I look back and, you know, he was even nasty and kind of juvenile in his criticism. And Ed didn't get the blues part of Texas like he did the country part of Texas. And that's all I can say, because, you know, he was probably thinking in his mind, like seeing Bob Marley and passing judgment on the Lotions. He'd written a book on Mike Bloomfield, the first white guy to kind of blaze a trail in modern American blues. So it's kind of hard to look at these white bands in Austin, but he kind of missed the train on that one. He didn't always get it right. But every time something came along, Ed was not wishy-washy. He wasn't, you know, there was no gray in Ed's life. It was white and black, you're right or wrong, yes and no. And he wasn't always right. And like I said, I took great pleasure in telling him when he was wrong, which he didn't always like hearing. But to me, that's what a beautiful friend was that happened to be in this very weird game that he taught me so much about. And we're now at this point now looking at rock and roll, and even this brief period when the culture blew up and there was this thing called criticism and passing judgment, and we couldn't wait to hear this latest album and whether it was any good. And we didn't have the internet. We couldn't just hear it for ourselves. We really depended on people like Ed to tell us, like he did with that Little Feat single. That's the first time I remember that I saw his byline. 1970 Rolling Stone, he's reviewing a single called Strawberry Flats, but all these Texas notes that run through that song, Ed saw and ferreted it out, and it made me want to go listen to this band and discover. And that's what rock critics did in their period of time. And today, I don't think we have that anymore. I mean, we're looking back at a period. But when I look at the whole period of music criticism, music writing, or that golden age, you know, Ed peaked early, man. He peaked when he was 22. And the rest has been almost like cream off the top. And it really is these stories of mentorship. And, you know, followed by, I'm sorry, the demise was not a pretty one. But I try to step back and look a little bit over the longer run, over the periods I knew him since the early 70s. And what a fantastic life, what an interesting life, what a hard friend to have, and yet what a cool guy to say, "This is my friend." That's all Ed.
Thanks. I guess I should mention, I mean, you talked about the Dump Ed Ward thing. Many years ago, Ed wrote to the Statesman, or well, he worked at the Statesman. I guess he probably dropped it on her desk, but he wrote to Ellie Rucker, who had a sort of Ask Ellie column where if you needed something, you know, you could write into her and she would try to find the answer. And he asked her where to find the best earplugs. And I wrote a letter to the Statesman saying, well, that explains it about Ed. He's going to these concerts wearing earplugs. And I got a letter from Ed. We had not met at that point. I got a personal letter from Ed. And I don't remember exactly what it said. I can remember the heat that I felt coming off of it, though. He was really, really pissed off at me. I think he probably remembered that when we became friends years later. We never brought it up. But I don't think he carried that grudge, at least. So next is Nate Wilcox, who co-founded the Let It Roll podcast with Ed. Nate, you there?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, I just want to share my gratitude for getting to know Ed and for all the music recommendations and all the food recommendations and all the arguments. And, Ed never took it easy on anybody, and he definitely didn't take it easy on himself. I first met Ed in the 80s when I read his book, his third of the Rolling Stone history of rock and roll. I didn't meet him in person for another 15 or 16 years after that. And I guess I knew him as a person for 17 years. But it was obvious that he was a gifted writer who could take a lot of disparate threads and weave them together into a coherent narrative. And the drop off from his section of the book and the rest of the book was just so disappointing. I could barely finish the book. I rarely noted who wrote magazine articles back then, or even, who contributed to an anthology piece. But with that piece, I said, who wrote this? Edward. What a weird name. And years later, I was so excited when John invited me to the South by Southwest breakfast to get to meet Ed. And I had some stupid questions about Brian Jones that I've been obsessed with since around that same time when I was 15 or so. And, Ed was always a delight and very patient. He didn't put up with any stupid questions. He would call me out when I said something stupid, but he was very patient to yammer on about topics that he was done with or bored with because I was interested with them. And then later on, getting to collaborate with him, I'd never planned to be a music writer or to focus on music. I was just looking for a podcast to do that didn't have to do with my day job, which is being a sports writer. And it was absolutely serendipity. I went to Ed's book signing and had been really pumped about that era of R&B and early rock and roll before that book came out. So when I saw that Ed was returning to that topic, I was really excited. Loved the book talk, and it just spur of the moment invited him to join me in a podcast, and was really surprised when he said yes. And then getting to work with Ed and getting, the privilege of getting to talk music in a serious way with Ed Ward for 28 hours or whatever it was a real honor. And I thought I came into it as a total know-it-all. And every time I talked to Ed, I learned more. And, I'm a slow student, and it took me a while to figure out what he was doing, but his methodology, Ed wasn't the kind of guy who just told you, go to this hole in the wall diner for some good Chinese food. He told you how to find those hole in the wall diners. Here's the symptoms to look for in a good out of the way restaurant. Here are the symptoms to look for in a music scene that's going to matter. And he was able to put things in a big picture in a way that I don't know of another writer who has done that to the same extent. And it was sad and frustrating to watch him self-sabotage. Every time I heard him talk about what was going on with NPR, what was going on with his publisher, I just wanted to grab him by the arms and shout, stop doing this to yourself, But, everybody's got their fate, and that was Ed's, and I will miss him. And I'm grateful that he wrote down his thoughts and shared his insights about music and food with so many people. And I'm really grateful to have known him.
Thanks a lot. So I have to apologize. Bob Simmons didn't get the link that I emailed out this morning, apparently, and I hope others didn't miss it too. But Bob, I think is here now. Are you here, Bob?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. And I apologize for that.
No, I just thank you, Gene Caffeine, for sending me the link. I got what I'd heard was we were going on at 3:30, which I was waiting for. I got to leave and go to the airport. Anyway, someone told me that you already read that doggerel that I wrote for him. So yeah,
that was a wonderful poem.
Well, it was funny about Ed. I mean, I don't think I ever knew him to arrive at a place where he wasn't already planning to leave. He's trying, I got to get out of this town. It's like, okay. I don't think he ever went to a concert that could have been a little better. It's, but you know, his knowledge was voluminous and his tolerance was somewhat minuscule. It was always fun to be around Ed because you know, you learned something while he was complaining, and that was the part I liked. What did I write here? He loved to cook. He loved to eat. His house was a wreck. It was not very neat. He had a big stinking dog and a big stinking Mercedes too. I knew Ed back in the 70s. We had the great honor to both have been retired from a position by the vaunted boy wonder Jan Winter, and we, you know, went through the revolving door of a Rolling Stone. Ed's departure was somewhat more dramatic than mine, at least according to the story that I've been told. But mine was just mere budgetary. We can't do that anymore. But you know, one of the things about Ed is you find that having shared distastes is almost as important as having shared tastes. So he and I saw eye to eye on a lot of stuff. But it was wonderful about how Ed kind of made well, what did I say here? It seemed like Ed seemed to like my little radio show because I was always format busting, you know, working at a rock station, then declaring that we needed to break from Led Zeppelin, putting on a few minutes of Segovia's Platero y Yo in the middle of the afternoon drive show. Always about to be fired seemed to appeal to his sense of justice. So we became friends. I'd seen him at the rip-off press parties or live concerts. We always kind of hung out and kibitzed. He was a fan of Gilbert Shelton and Robert Crumbs. And it was very surprising to me there in San Francisco when I found out he'd taken a job in my old hometown of Austin. Maybe it's because of Gilbert and some of the rip-off guys. Anyway, he thought it'd be a good place to go and be writerly. He was not tempted by other scenes like Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, I don't know, Oklahoma. He could have ended up in Oklahoma City. That'd been good. Anyway, he thought there was a scene here, and having gone to Antioch, he was not averse to small towns that had something happening. When Ed got to Austin, it was still a small town. He did what he could to make it grow up and lose that parochial charm, for better or worse. He helped put Austin on a national stage with national standards. He seems to have lived up to the challenge, or the town has lived up to the challenge better than some of us had hoped. So anyway, then that was where I was going to insert my doggerel, but I think Joe Nick has already done the honors. Anyway, bye, Ed. You're a pal.
Thank you so much, Bob. Our next presenter is my partner, Scoop Sweeney.
Thank you, John. And I feel kind of repetitive now. People have, I had a list of things I wanted to cover, and everyone covered it. I know my experience wasn't unique. I met Ed back in the mid-'70s when he was writing for Cream, and I was writing for Zodiac News Service in San Francisco. And we had a mutual friend, Tom Miller, who had a book out on the Kennedy assassination. I'd helped him with a chapter, and we were trying to do a promotional tour. And of course, Ed jumped right in, being Ed, and really helped push us to places that we probably wouldn't have had access, except Ed said, well, let me make you a call. And of course he did. And after that, we got to know each other through just encountering encounters at various venues. And I'd ask Ed for some tips. I was a political writer before I came into being a music editor at Zodiac News. And I asked him for some hints. And he jumped right in and basically agreed to tutor me on the fine points of the business in San Francisco in exchange for the fact that I had a working automobile. Ed had a Mercedes, but it was less a car and more a lawn ornament. I don't think it ever ran, at least not in the time I knew Ed.
But it was decorative.
But he was just a special kind of guy. When you were his friend, would step up for you. And he did that for me, introducing me to taking me out to dinner with the Clash, you know, and that got me street cred with my daughter, who was a big fan anyway. But he just did that. You know, he may have wanted a ride, but he also wanted to introduce me to stuff that he thought was important. And that served me really well later in life, just to remember to don't treat your friends as you know, something other than a friend. You know, don't use them and throw them away. And Ed was that kind of a guy. And you know, I think he could have been a successful tour guide, because reading his blog, he enjoyed traveling and he enjoyed talking and writing about it. And so that's one thing I really miss the most about Ed, is just his take on things that I might not have paid attention to, but he would spot it and make it sound really special. And you know, he was a special guy, and I hope to encounter him on the other side. I'm sure he's there. If he doesn't like what's happening in rock and roll heaven, I'm sure he'll tell everybody about it.
Hey guys, I gotta go. I gotta go to the airport. Nice seeing everybody. Take care.
Good seeing you, Bob.
All right. Yeah, I'm glad that Bob made it. Next on our list is Eric Dice.
Everybody,
There, Eric?
yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. I just jotted down some free verse, and I'm going to thank, as we say, Gary Larson, but not that Gary Larson. 1, you burst on the scene already alleged of being ornery, unduly opinionated, a blunderbuss. Too late for Labor Day inaugural outing, New Mexico Chili Pepper Harvest Fest. Pass the plates around, boys. We're having Big Jim tonight. Your first words to Hatch Working Group. You want in on the nuances? You better send me your real name. HWG is unpronounceable except in Welsh. 2, on Avery Island, dodging McElhenney's Tabasco heisters, navigating big diamonds of back roads and levees, passing through parishes, sighting on radio towers. Crawfish at Hawks, Udon Blanc and New Iberia, Bow Bridge, Opelousas, Ville Platte, Swamp Rock record stores, and a Saturday jam session at Mark Savoy's. Outer Ring for tourists, be sure to bring beer or food. Crowley Rice Museum, never open. Sign at Matilda's disallows your swears, but holy fuck, this is good. Insects buzzing as we sip a beat on lounge chairs in the parking lot of the Stone Motel. No stone, stoneless, no stolen car. And Bettina bequeaths a native Louisiana honorific, Cap'n. 3, your last words to Hatch Working Group. Road trip. 4, thinking of you, stumbling through the Bardo, inhaling the smoke, considering recommending a different wood, insulting the stokers about the alignment of the smoke chambers, watching you disappear as you take a long, cool drink from the River Lethe.
That's beautiful,
Thank you.
Eric.
That's great, Eric. I see people are applauding, but they're muted. So
Well, I'm unmuted and I'm applauding.
So our next speaker is Jason Gross. Are you here, Jason?
Wow.
That was interesting. There's Jason. Your audio is not quite coming through.
It's fascinating.
Is that better?
There we go.
Okay, sorry. Okay, thanks. Well, I mean, I'm honored to be here speaking about Ed. I'd known him since the mid-90s when I started writing, and he was one of the first people to give me encouragement. And if that wasn't enough, he also gave me a grand tour of Berlin when he lived there, and he was the person who convinced me to go to South by Southwest in 1999. I went there every year since then, and I've worked as a moderator, a panelist, a moderator, trainer for most of the time. And for most of those years, I would also meet up with Ed, and he would show me the sights of Austin and the best restaurants there. And I even got to stay with him at his house in 2020, just after South by got canceled. All of which is to say, I owe Ed quite a bit. Thinking about him and his work, as a co-founder of South by, he had, as was said before, an unimaginable impact on the city of Austin, you know, helping to make it a national and global powerhouse, not to mention, you know, the impact the festivals had on the music industry, the film industry, the tech industry. And, you know, that's something all of us could only dream of achieving, really. For his work as a writer, like a lot of scribes from his generation, he didn't get the respect and attention that he deserved, and that did bother him. But what I really admired about him is that it didn't stop him from doing his work. And quite frankly, I would see him and others his age struggle to find a niche in the digital online world, and was glad that, frankly, I kept my day job just to be practical seeing that. But he just kept his head down. He kept doing great work right until the end. And his History of Rock and Roll series was something he was still working on and would still speak enthusiastically about it. When I was interviewing friends and colleagues for an online series of articles to honor him, what struck me, as it does now from hearing from all of you, was that they shared a lot of the same feelings that I did about him. And Ed, as we know, could be frustrating and dogged in his way, but he left an indelible impression on a lot of people. And even though there were a lot of writers who also encouraged me, influenced me, and helped me, I honestly can't think of many others that I would spend so much time trying to honor with a bunch of articles and interviews about their work. I'd like to think that even though we want to share now how much he meant to us and share memories, Ed, being Ed, would appreciate the kind words, but also would be, frankly, kind of eye-rolling at some of the sentimentality that, you know, I'm spewing out here. That's just how he was. So maybe in that spirit, I'd like to share something musical that I think he'd appreciate. Several years ago at a South by panel, Link Wray's classic instrumental Rumble was being played over the speakers. I can't remember why exactly. And during the Q&A, Ed, who was standing at the back of the room with me, pointed out that the version they played wasn't the original version that he knew and loved. The original, he insisted, had a big, blaring, ugly guitar sound blasting out those indelible chords, which he promptly mimicked and demonstrated with some air guitar that I think Ray would have appreciated. And in that spirit, if you don't mind, I'd like to share a few seconds of that. So there you see exactly what he was talking about. That's it. And thanks for everything, Ed. And thank you for putting this together.
Thank you. Let's see. We have one more scheduled speaker, and that's Robert Draper. Robert, you still here?
Yep, I sure am. Yeah, sorry, I was away for a bit, had to go feed the dog. I don't mean that in a Jeffrey Toobin kind of way. I actually was feeding a dog. Anyway, hello, everyone, or as Ed would say, hello. Taking in all the candid and somewhat conflicted appraisals of our old friend, I sometimes feel like somebody should invent a new punctuation mark called the ed, something that signifies that one statement will automatically be followed by another statement that either equivocates from or completely is incompatible with the first statement. I feel, at least for me, wrestling with both the fact of his tragedy and the seeming inevitability of it, feeling warmth towards him, but also this persistent irritation. Certainly, I'm among those friends of Ed who at one time or another experienced a falling out with him. He was, in one sense, quite loyal, and in another sense, the one friend you could count on to denounce you behind your back, an acute critic of just about everyone and everything, and yet he possessed this almost complete lack of self-awareness. He was like this unsquarable circle of a human being. For me, the simplest, and cleanest way for me to think about Ed is to think of my post-collegiate 1980s, a decade that to me today is absolutely unimaginable without Ed Ward's presence in it. It's been more or less referenced before that back then Austin was something like the Shire, this sleepy Hobbiton, and then Ed was our rude awakening to the fact that we were nowhere near as clever and talented as we thought we were. There was nothing quite like being disabused by his blunt, "No, wrong." But for those of us who were young and culturally wayward and willing to cop to all that, Ed was there to be our Pied Piper. At least that's the case when it came to music and food. As a guide to other things, he could be unintentionally hilarious, of course, especially when discussing women. It was always a joy to hear Ed break it down plainly. There were women who he was certain were interested in him, and then there were lesbians. And yet somehow this deeply awkward person was this legitimate arbiter of cool. Ed met me when I was anything but cool, when I was a struggling freelancer whose work no one would want to publish. This morning, I decided to Google my name together with his to see what would come up. And the very first thing that does on the Google machine is this Austin Chronicle Music Awards poll from 1984 that properly ranked Ed Ward as the city's best music writer and very charitably ranked me number 6, just edging out Jody Denberg. And me being one of Ed's many acolytes at that time was a very comfortable place for us both. And with that uneven playing field established, Ed made a considerable difference in my professional life. He got me a lot of music writing gigs. Then he handed over to me a job he himself didn't want, to write a disposable paperback biography of ZZ Top. And then when I decided I wanted to do something a little more serious and decided to write a book about the history of Rolling Stone magazine, Ed was really the way into literally dozens of former staff writers and editors. Along the way, he also told me stories about his own experiences at the magazine, many of which unfortunately did not pass the fact-checking test. And he was disappointed when I didn't include them in the book, but nonetheless took that opportunity to tell people about those stories anyway. Our falling out, if you could call it that, occurred a couple of years later in 1992 when Ed took to loudly opining really to anyone who was interested and those who weren't about the state of my flagging marriage at that point. He then moved off to Berlin, I moved off to Washington, and we stayed in sort of sporadic and mostly congenial contact. The last I had with him was actually 5 years ago when, fittingly enough, I guess, a new Rolling Stone biographer, Joe Hagan, had arrived on the scene, and Ed was once again playing intermediary, only this time setting up Joe to talk to me. I'm going down memory lane here a bit, but having said that, I never really saw Ed as emblematic of that era or really any other era, or really emblematic of anything other than himself. He was a true anomaly. He never really fit anywhere with anyone, and yet he still imposed himself on the world more like a weather system that roars through this unsuspecting terrain that centuries later still bears the imprint of that system for anthropologists to puzzle over. Already poems have been read today, and so I'm not going to read another one, but there is one I just wanted to reference, written by a young British soldier nearly a century ago who died at the Battle of Normandy, named Keith Douglas. And the only thing I'll say about its contents is its title, which really says it all. The title is Simplify Me When I'm Dead, meaning keep it straightforward, keep it uncomplicated, keep it short and sweet. An exercise in polite dishonesty, in other words. And I would love to have had one last chance to proffer that poem to Ed in his final days, just to see the look on his face as he eyed the title, pursed his lips, and then tossed it back in my face and just said, "No, wrong." Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. So now we're all here assembled. Everyone has spoken who's signed up to speak. And we promised an open mic. I want to mention that Eric mentioned that Ed's last message to the Hatch Working Group was road trip. And the context for that was that there was a particular wine that he was talking about called Old Patch Red. And he got some of us really excited about the idea of putting our hands on that, but it wasn't something that you could just get. It's sort of local to a particular area in California. And that was going to be our road trip. We were going to drive out there and get some wine. So who else would like to talk? Carl?
Maybe I'd like to say something, if I
All
may.
right. Sure.
Checking in from Tokyo. It's basically 5:30 in the morning here, so I haven't put on my makeup yet. So I had the chance to actually do a road trip with Ed. We went through Louisiana. I'm not sure exactly what year it was, but it was a memorable trip nonetheless. And we went to Hawks and ate crawfish. He told me that I would never be able to find it on my own, but I did. But 2 years later, we went together. And along the way, we had, a lot of great food. And I'll always remember Ed for his invaluable kind of, he gave us so many good tips about where to go and how to find great places. But the story I'd like to tell is something that I've shared on the private message group that has been referenced before, that myself and Eric Theis and Tom Welch, who I think may be on this call, are members. Is a story from 1979. I had read Eric. I was familiar with Ed's columns in Rolling Stone from 1975 or so, but in 1979 he was on a panel as part of a conference that was going on in New York called New Music New York. This was a collection of experimental musicians who completely marginal. If David Gans thinks that he was marginal, I can assure him that we were more marginal then and maybe now. What Ed showed up on the panel, these panels were mostly bitch sessions that people came together to complain about how there was no scene. Why don't we have a scene? Where can we have gigs? Why don't festivals book us? We're so fucked. And Ed said the truth, which was what? Go out and make your scene. And everybody hated him, including me. But the truth is that he was right. He was absolutely right. We needed to go out and make our scene, which is what we did. And later on, New Music New York became New Music America. It became a scene. Experimental music became something bigger. And Ed followed us along. I don't think Ed ever remembered that I was there. I didn't introduce myself, but maybe, let's see, 1979, 7 years later. Told me when I was going to Berlin that this guy, he said, Ward, he's a critic. Why don't you look him up? He's going to be there on tour. Give him a call. And I did. And that was the start of my relationship with Ed.
Carl, you're blocking your microphone.
Oh, fuck. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Better.
How far back do I have to go?
It's fine
Oh.
now. You said
Yeah,
you're-
not too far.
It was clear, but it was just a little muddy.
Okay, sorry about
How
that.
could it be both of those things? We heard.
Yeah. I'm on a iPad. So Tom Welsh recommended that I give him a call when I came through Berlin, and I did. And that was really the start of my relationship with Ed. He was, he was decent. He showed me around Berlin, some secret places in East Berlin. And we continued after that. I think that I'm one of the few people that he shared a secret with, which is about kind of his demise. He apparently, according to him, was friends with a woman who met a woman in an airport. And that woman in the airport gave that friend a tip about a deal. I don't remember the details, but that woman and his friend, he trusted. And he had just inherited a lot of money from the death of his father or mother. I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly. And he went all in. He put all his chips on the table. He went full course, and it was a scam, and he lost everything. And that was the beginning of the end for Ed. This would have been 2002. He blamed it on 2001, the fact that there was an attack and it crashed the economy and blah blah blah. But I felt that was the beginning. After that, he started to live in a kind of poverty. He came to Japan right before he flew business class. He was kind of top of the world, and then everything collapsed under him. So by 2002, he was destitute. And he told me that he was sometimes doing dumpster diving. It really makes me sad to think about that. After Berlin, of course, he moved to France. He tried to eke out a stake there. It was really hard. He almost got evicted numerous times. I think that I don't know. I'm just really sorry that a guy like him, so talented, so smart, such good sense, could be so self-destructive. And when I think about Ed, I'm always going to think about him that way. I love him very much, but I'm sorry what happened. That's my message.
Okay, thanks, Carl. Anybody else want to speak?
Just
Yeah,
wanna
that's-
say thanks also, Carl. That's a tough story to tell. It's not something I knew most of. So thanks for clearing the air on that.
Yeah. His own worst enemy is one of those recurring themes with Ed.
Indeed. Anyone else?
Hey, well, that was really heartfelt. This is Jean Caffeine. The last time I saw Ed, it didn't even seem like he recognized me. So I was wondering what was going on. The second to last time I saw him, I yelled at him. So I've been feeling pretty bad and guilty and not very compassionate. So I appreciate all that Carl put out there. When I first got here, I did have a little moment, and he helped with that. He really, I was really trying to put it out there, and he saw something in me that maybe hadn't even come together yet. And he helped me get a little deal. The only time I've ever put out a record that I didn't pay for was through a friend of Ed's. That brought me to Berlin, and that made us competitors for an apartment that my band was supposed to stay at, that Ed was staying at for free. So, there were little things like that. I did not know any of that backstory that Carl said, but it was very apparent how hand to mouth Ed's existence was after, at least to me, after he went to Berlin. And it was an endless struggle. And I am grateful for him, not only for getting me my little deal, but for turning me on to like a badass Chinese restaurant in my own hometown, San Francisco, that I didn't even know about, House of Nanking. I would have never gone there. And we may have even gone there together, like Ed, hardcore foodie and rock and roller. I'm a little mad at myself for being so mad at him, but he was a lot, and gratitude was not his strength. It's not mine either. And, I can go a little dark too, like Ed. When the teeth fell out, that broke my heart. I remember going to take him out to eat, and he could only eat soup. But then the next time I saw him, when I yelled at him, he was like bitching about the dental work that everybody else had paid for, and I just sort of had it. So he's not the only intolerant one. And, after listening to Carl, I wish I had more compassion. And I have not even been able to write the little Facebook obit because my feelings were so conflicted. But now I know everybody's feelings were conflicted. He was very smart, very savvy, knew all the cool stuff, invited me to eat at his house. I'm thankful for all of that. It did go awry. I didn't like it when he was so bitter. But, life will hand you some shit. And it's really hard not to get bitter when that happens. Anyways, and Joanna was here. We know Ed from such different reasons, but we're here on the call together. And I really wanted her to speak because she knew Ed besides Louise. Is it Louise? She knew Ed probably the longest because she knew Ed in college. She knew a different Ed.
Yeah, so my name is Joanna. When I met him, it was 1969, and he rented a room in the upstairs of a house in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And there were four of us all together, 4 students renting rooms in the upstairs of a house in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And he had the biggest room, and he had a sink and a refrigerator and a huge record collection. And I was given the opportunity to listen to his records on his record player, none of which we had at that point, in exchange for, and I could also wash dishes in his sink instead of going downstairs to wash them in the bathtub, in exchange for washing his dishes. So it was a good relationship there. And so 1969, 1970, we were next door neighbors. And during that time, it happened that I went to a lecture by somebody named Mildred Loomis, who was billed as the grandmother of homesteading, Yellow Springs, Ohio. She said she needed somebody to buy half of her farm, her organic farm, because her stepson had inherited it because her husband had died intestate. And I was so wanting to buy that farm or buy half the farm. And I told Ed, and Ed told some other people the way that Ed did, talking, about people to each other. And then those people told Mildred Loomis, hey, there's this girl in Yellow Springs, Ohio, who wants to buy half your farm. And so as a result, my then boyfriend, later husband, and I became organic farmers. And it was totally thanks to Ed. And I mean, really such an instrument of fate. And I want to say, Ed, wherever you are, I am totally grateful for that gossiping, if you will, that got us in that direction. It made all the difference. And we learned things we never would have learned in college, ever, ever, ever. Like that people who only had 5th grade education. And then we lost touch, and some years passed, and we were in Sausalito or San Francisco. Anyway, we were visiting and saw his byline on a newspaper, and looked him up and got to be friends again. And he strongly encouraged us to move to Austin, Texas, where we are right this moment. And here's Larry Vaughn.
Yeah, I knew Ed from South by Southwest. He was, had connections with South by Southwest, and they would put him up in a nice hotel. So a nice hotel, but he wanted to spend a little bit more time in Austin than was actually paid for. So he stayed with us, and I got to know Ed as a housemate, and which was really cool. He loved to walk down to the local convenience store, which happens to have a very good selection of beer. He loved IPA beer. That was his thing. And I got turned on to a couple of local restaurants, which I frequent now. I mean, I love going out and eating with Ed, although he was very picky. As we all know, he being a critic was not limited did not stop at the door of a restaurant. we had some very nice conversations, and it told me a lot of lights, and I got a fairly nice CD assortment from Ed that he would he would just pass on. So I miss you, Ed, wherever you are, and good luck with your next journey.
Thanks so much. Anyone else?
Hearing all these people telling all these different stories that sort of have the same similar contours, people can be teachers in negative ways as well as positive ways. And Ed was an object lesson in how not to carry yourself in certain ways. And as hard as it was to watch him do these things, it was also important, to learn from his mistakes. It's a weird thing to say, but he was a teacher in a negative way as well as a positive way. And all that generosity that he directed toward other people, he couldn't manage for himself somehow.
He could be such a pain in the ass, but you couldn't help but love him,
Well, yeah, we were shared a private space in the well with, a couple of dozen people for a very, very long time, including a lot of Texans. So we were sort of privy to various aspects of his life story along the way. And there was a hell of a lot of like, oh my God, don't do that, but you couldn't stop him. He was headstrong and determined to follow his own impulses.
Anybody else?
John, can I come in from Ohio here?
Sure.
Greetings to everyone from Ohio. Thanks for
Tom.
inviting
Tom
me
Welsh.
in. And Eric and Carl and John know me under the guise of the Hatch Working Group, our not very secret but extremely exclusive food group. Everyone's welcome. You guys will forgive me if I repeat the short version of the story you've heard me tell after Ed passed, which was that I was given the task of transporting a can of salsa or tomatoes from Brent Grilke in Austin to Ed in Berlin. So I was the mule on that one, and for the life of me, I can't remember if it was tomatoes or salsas or what, but for whatever reason, Brent knew that Ed had requested a very specific favorite thing, and I was the mule to get it to him. Maybe you guys down there in Austin will know better what precisely it was, but it was a big can of tomatoes. And it was in my bag, which was ripped off from me on the train on the way to Berlin. And so I had to present myself to meet Ed in person for the very first time. I think we'd corresponded, and I'm sure we'd corresponded in email about music related stuff, but I'd never met him before. And I climbed the stairs to this apartment in Berlin, I think maybe the same one that Gene was fighting for. Present myself, and I have the distinction, I think, listening to all of you guys, probably not the sole distinction, but it's a real distinction nevertheless, that when the door opened and I explained who I was, I'm here, I'm Tom, the important can of salsa that I'm supposed to bring to you has been stolen. I arrive empty-handed, and Ed's first words to me were, "Fuck you." And so I recognize the heavier side of all of this. I felt the electric shock, but I wasn't so close to him that I've ever felt the pain that some of you guys are sharing here today. And that night in Berlin was a wild one. We had a great time, maybe too great, until Ed disappeared into the night and left me to fend for myself in a place where I didn't speak the language. And everything worked out, of course. And here we are, able to tell that story. I'm eternally grateful for that. And sorry we didn't have more time.
That was Ed's German.
I don't think I ever heard a word of it. I don't know if anyone else here did either.
Not so great, frankly. but somehow he survived.
Anyone else? As they say, speak now or forever hold your peace.
I just want to say something.
Okay.
I want to say thanks to John for organizing this. You
thanks.
did a great job.
Thanks, Carl.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
I always feel like pretty much anything I do is kind of like Wayne's World, but really, it's best to just keep it simple. What was the thing about simplify me when I'm dead? Well, we're keeping it simple.
John, I'd like to follow up on some of the things Joanna said. I was that boyfriend in the upstairs area that we shared with Ed, and doing dishes for Ed, as you all know, was not light work. After we moved to Austin, we often went over to his place for dinner, and I swear he turned out the most incredible dishes, but you had to really close your eyes looking around the kitchen, or you probably wouldn't eat anything. It was just, he lived in incredible disarray, as you all know. But we became great friends, even better friends during that period, because he often took us and later my kids, Jesse and Marina, out to different music venues to meet musicians and so forth. It was really exciting. And all the writers in Austin, some of whom I remember from there. But one thing I wanted to contribute is about his time in France. I went there, well, maybe a year or so before he went back to Austin in Montpellier. And we made arrangements with him to, well, I would rent a car and he would drive us around and show us all the sights. And of course, you know, he was an incredible traveler, as you all know. Knew so much and learned absorbed so much about the environment that he was in, socially and historically and environmentally. And in exchange, we'd support Ed's eating and drinking habit while we were there. That turned out to be a very expensive undertaking. But anyway, we rented the car, and on the first day we're driving around, and Ed, he had that old Mercedes in Austin. Later, he had a BMW. They didn't run much of the time, which was very fortunate for other drivers in Austin. On these trips on these little roads in France, he was careening around corners, and he was within inches of going off the narrow roads to the side. And very quickly, we said, Ed, can you please turn over the driving? Okay, no problem. Just one syllable or two, one word, excuse me. So we took over the driving, but we had an incredible time visiting little villages, having local wines, having local foods. And in the Montpellier itself, we'd go out to dinner every night to, of course, very incredible, but quite expensive places, consume more than a couple of bottles of wine. And after we were going to stay 2 weeks, we stayed a little over a week and decided we better move on or our budget would be shot for the rest of our trip. But we really loved being with Ed. And he was, as you said, he was completely penniless. He didn't know where his next check was going to come from. He was already behind on his rent. He wouldn't have eaten if we weren't there. Actually, it was a thin period of his life. But we had a great time. And we kind of came in after, it had been 15 years since I'd really seen much of him. And we just didn't miss a beat, And that was the thing about Ed. And, when the time I was in Austin, most nights during the week, we'd get together for a while and sit on in his living room and just an endless roll of stories about some of the most incredible, eclectic stuff. He was so erudite. And it was really a pleasure to know it. And he also mentored me in writing, which was great. The first thing I wrote, I handed to him and he completely trashed it. And I didn't want to ever talk to him again, of course. But he made it into an acceptable piece, which is to his credit, and taught me a lot about writing, as he has some of the others here. So anyway, I miss Ed a lot. I didn't get to know much about him in the last few years, but occasionally corresponded through Facebook or email, but not as much as now I wish I had. So thanks for this, John.
Yeah, when I was, I was like 19 or 20 years old, and I had been to Austin and had seen Shiva's Head Band, and I think they had just released an album. anyway, I wrote this piece about Shiva's Headband, a review basically, and sent it to Rolling Stone, and I got a rejection. And it was, a very nice rejection letter that kind of took the time to tell me what I might have done differently or what I should have added to it. And years later, actually just a very few, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I found that rejection letter that I got, and it was from Ed. So my very first rejection letter ever came from Ed Ward. And it took me many years to realize it. Anyone else?
I guess, hi, I'm Jesse.
Hey, Jesse.
Hey, you heard from both my parents there separately, but I'm just realizing I'm maybe the only person besides Louise that knew him when I was a child. So a little different perspective. Everything that came in was, I didn't have the filter as much to know what to reject or what have you, but he tended to treat kids more like they were adults. And as my dad was saying, included us in a lot of things, took us to concerts and gave us music that he thought we'd be interested in, and was always very encouraging and, harsh sometimes, but maybe not to the extent that he was with adults. So maybe he didn't treat us completely like adults. And I always relied on him when I would travel places. I would check in with him because he'd been so many places and was always offering tips and sometimes wanting me to get something there and bring it to him. So a lot of similar things. The thing that just kind of popped into my head that I'd forgotten about, and I'm kind of curious if it's out there somewhere, if you wrote it down or anything. One time he came to our house on Thanksgiving, and he told the craziest ghost story, something that had happened to him when he was, I guess maybe before he was living in the building in Yellow Springs with my parents. It was a whole very long thing, and it was a Thanksgiving dinner, and it was, just my dad wasn't there, so it was like 2 kids, my mom and Ed, and very strange timing. But the most amazing story really blew me away. It was all about how the ghosts were getting in through these circles, and there were too many circles in the house. And he so strongly believed in this ghost story, and it really surprised me, I think, in retrospect, when I guess now that I think about it, it kind of was, he was such a rational guy. It didn't seem like someone who was going to be thinking of the supernatural in that way at the time. And I don't think I'd ever heard a story quite like it. I wish I remembered it all. And I guess if anyone knows of it being out there somewhere, let me know, because I'd be curious to read that or remember the details more. Anyway, Ed was an important figure for me, close friends with my parents, and, very, very fatherly in his unusual way. And I miss him and love him very much.
Thanks, Jesse. I see some applause happening out there. All right, we've gone for an hour and a half. We really had scheduled this for 2 hours. I wasn't sure that we could fill 2 hours, but I'm just wondering if anybody has anything else to say before we drop off.
Seemed like Peter was going to say something a bit ago. I don't know, Peter, do you have anything?
Yeah. Hi.
Hey, Peter.
I'm Peter Milners. I'm a PJM on the well. I've been on the well for 20 years. That's how I got to know Ed. But interestingly, I became aware of Ed before that because of the Fresh Air pieces. And so I was aware of him and knew who he was. And then I'm on the well, cruising along in there. And one day, hey, Ed Ward's on the well. That's pretty cool. And I didn't think I'd ever particularly get to know him, but the last few years we ended up co-hosting a conference together. It's a conference called Big Balls. I have the page up right now. I'll explain it to you. Welcome to Big Balls. This is a conference about American roots music. And we covered conversations just all over the place about old time cowpunk, Western swing, honky tonk, bluegrass, rockabilly, Bakersfield, blues, Cajun Zydeco, Appalachian, Tex-Mex, alt country. So you can imagine why Ed was in there and why he was interested in that conference. And when one of our co-hosts moved along several years ago, people were looking for a co-host, and some people said, Ed, do it. And he said, okay, I don't know this technical stuff at all. And he needed somebody to coast along with him. And I volunteered because I love this kind of music. And turned out Ed didn't want to do the technical stuff at all. Because the well is interesting. You can use it through a web interface called Engaged. But if you actually want to do anything technical to manage the conferences, you really need to use a command line to do it. And so I knew how to do the command line stuff, and Ed had no interest in that at all. So we didn't exchange emails, and somebody's asking for this, and I could actually, because I'd watched him on the well for many years, and I could actually hear his voice in the emails. Somebody's looking for this. Can you take care of that? So I would go in and fix the thing and do it. And we had a really interesting relationship in terms of that, where I saw a lot of the gruffness and that, but I never experienced it personally with him, because we were always just either trying to take care of the business of that particular conference, or when he was in Europe, I became aware that he was having some issues, and I sent him money a couple times, and he was almost embarrassed, but he was super appreciative of it. And, it helped him, through a couple times where he was down to he could pay his bills, but a couple people said he couldn't really eat. And I sent him enough money that he could get a little bit of something decent to eat, not just, whatever scrape along food that you eat in Germany, or France. And so, I felt good that I could do that for him. And I think he, in his own way, maybe took it a little easier on me in our interactions, because he felt that we had a positive connection like that. And, it's funny because, you admire somebody from afar when you see them doing public stuff, and then you get to know them in person. And in person or in online, the person is never as wonderful as they appear to be, ever. And I've learned that many, many, many years ago. So I was just always happy that I could have a connection with Ed that was just functional and useful. And I helped him out with stuff when he needed to be helped out with it. And then he took care of, he was the face of the conference and responding to people, and when people brought topics up and that sort of thing, and keeping things interesting and giving people the deep information on stuff that none of it. And there are people that have been doing roots music for their entire lives, listening to it, playing it. There are professional musicians in well-known bands with top 40 hits in this conference, and Ed knew more than all of them put together. And it was amazing. And every single one of those people admired his knowledge and his willingness to bring the stories out and to tell people, about this music that we all love together. Thanks.
Thank you. So we can wind down now. I'm just wondering if anybody wants to contribute any more. Bill Brash, you kind of look like you might have something to say. Oh, wow. You're invisible.
This is Louise. Let me just say thank you I want to thank everybody for the stories. And remember, if you do want them in the website, please send them to me and I'll get them up there. So thanks for everything.
And thank you so much, Louise, for joining us.
The website, Louise, has been great. I've read a lot of the essays up there, and I really appreciate you doing that. And the picture you put up on the front is just perfect.
I got lost coming over
Thank
the
you.
hill and then back. Oh, oops.
I'm just putting up that picture for a minute.
That's
Yeah.
nice. John, I just want to say thanks again.
You are quite welcome, Carl. I hope you can stay awake another minute.
pretty.
I'm almost gone.
What time?
Anybody else?
I end up invisible.
Oh yeah, the invisible Bill Brash.
Yeah, you know, Ed was on the skip town list that Bob Simmons set up. So I actually knew, like Peter, I knew him a little bit before I found him on the well, and it kind of made the well feel a little more cool to me that he was there. Right, I'm going to go check out Big Balls. So thank you for doing this.
Yeah, it was such a great contributor on the well.
Yeah.
It really became a big part of his life.
Yeah. He wasn't all just opinions. He was full of information. I mean, he certainly was happy to share his intense judgments with us on any number of things, but he also just knew stuff. And I also have to say that I was amazed at how much information he packed into those history of rock and roll books and how incredibly smoothly it flowed. And when all is said and done, the fucker was a great writer.
And I'll just chip in and say, you know, if when Ed was confronted with new information or new opinion, he, you know, to the end, he was willing to flex and incorporate that and change his mind, at least with food things, which is how I mostly knew him.
Which reminds me of the first time that Ed cooked Indian for us in 1980, shortly after he moved to Austin. He put on a pretty good show for my wife and I, Chris, over at his place. And it was really great up until the point where we had to utter the lines, Ed, Papadum's on fire, that we got some drama in there. And the whole place was up in smoke. And Ed's screaming and yelling, trying to put the fire out. Was he'd been cool up to that point, but he kind of lost it when the Papadum burned. Ed, the Papadum's on fire. No! That's how I remember Ed.
I think it was Eric who got Ed on the well, if I'm not mistaken. And so I think we should all say thanks to Ed, to Eric.
Well, and also to Howard Rheingold, because Ed was a member of the well, but he didn't get terribly active until we had that breakfast I mentioned earlier with Howard Rheingold. And I guess Howard and I were both like talking to him at length about it and got him a little more excited about it.
Good day.
I had forgotten, my own well account went away like 10 or so years ago, but I'd forgotten that Ed went by Captain Ward on there, because I do think that that nickname came from the road trip that I talked about. Whether
Yeah, that was you. That was you, bro.
Yeah. Surprising what comes back when.
Oh, that's interesting. Somebody's sharing Big Balls with us.
That's Peter, the co-host.
Oh, cool.
And those of you who aren't familiar with the well, you can see that this is
So you can take a quick look at it.
only system. No ads, no graphics. You can click on, you can put links in there to graphics, but they you can't like paste endless movies and shit into your posts.
Right.
It just works. And that's one of the things that makes it such a glorious place.
Yeah.
This is Ed's brother-in-law, Frank.
Hey, Frank.
And
Hi, Frank.
I just thought, yeah, as someone who married into my relationship with the Ward family and with Ed, I think it's worth mentioning that right until the end, I was constantly reminded by people I knew or acquaintances, mere strangers, of his extremely public persona. All of you were close to him in a personal way, but I met so many people who really felt they knew him because of fresh air. And that was a huge thing to be celebrated in itself, even if I could never follow his stories. And
I contrast that with the enigma of his life. And it's a small family that I married into, but none of us knew, we all knew all the troubles all of you have repeated, and none of us ever knew what to do about it. But there's that extraordinarily, incredibly public, celebrated figure, and this really tragic person whom all of us were trying to reach. And between the webpage and today, that keeps hitting home as a point of sadness. But we should also remember how many people were routinely touched by his incredible visibility and the joy he brought them.
Thanks, Frank.
Oh. Even his relationship with Fresh Air was complicated. I remember him telling me some stories. But what's really touching about this session together today is that I think we're all being honest that Ed was a very beautiful person, but a very complicated person and a very difficult person, and nobody's denying that. It's not just saying that someone is a saint and we should all adore him, but we're recognizing his greatness as well as his humanity, as well as his flaws. And that's the most touching thing to me.
That might be a good note to end this on, unless anybody has any final words.
Oh, I think that's what Carl sums it up nicely. The fact all of us loved him in spite of all of all of the difficulties that he presented. That says a lot about him too. And all is said and done.
Eric had mentioned the road trip thing. I just want to quickly share. This was what the conversation was about. We were going to go get some Old Patch Red. By gosh. And we may yet do it, and drink a toast to Ed.
Road trip.
Road trip. So thanks everybody for joining us.
Thanks, John.
Thanks for doing this, John.
And just to let you know again, this we've been live streaming to YouTube, and I will send that link. So thanks everybody.
John. Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.